I had always known the bistro would be mine one day, but I never imagined it would happen like this. So suddenly, so soon. When my mother passed away a year ago, I was left with more than just the family business. I inherited her legacy, her final words ringing in my ears. Promise me you'll never change the menu, Gabrielle. People need something they can rely on. Those words felt sacred, like a vow I could never break, even as the world around me changed. La Petite Cuisine had been my mother's pride and joy for the last 30 years, a small bistro tucked in the heart of a neighborhood that once buzzed with life but was now fading. The neon sign outside flickered weakly, just like the bistro's reputation. The menu hadn't changed since the day they opened. It was full of comforting, simple dishes: chicken pot pie, mashed potatoes, salads. Food that warmed the soul, but wasn't exactly what the world of food critics or Instagram influencers were raving about. Still, it was what people knew, what they relied on. And that's what kept them coming back, year after year. But over the last few months, it felt like the world had moved on without us. The new eateries popping up down the street had sleek designs, trendy menus, and dishes that looked more like works of art than something you could actually eat. Meanwhile, my mother's recipes, my grandmother's recipes for that matter, felt old-fashioned, stuck in another time. The regulars, those who had been loyal for decades, were aging, and the new customers just weren't showing up. The bistro was slowly dying, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I had tried to make some changes, small things at first, revamping the decor, tweaking the menu a little, but it never felt right. I knew deep down I was only making excuses to delay the inevitable. My ex-boyfriend Julian had been the first to say it out loud. Gabrielle, you're stuck in the past. This place is sinking, and you're too loyal to let it go. Those words stung more than I wanted to admit. He was right. I could feel the weight of that truth every time I walked into the empty bistro. The idea of changing the menu, of letting go of my mother's recipes, felt like a betrayal. It felt like erasing her, erasing everything we had built. But I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep up the charade. The bistro needed something it didn't have, something fresh, something people could get excited about again. But I just couldn't bring myself to let go of the promise I'd made to my mother. So there I was, at 29, standing behind the counter of a dying bistro, watching the clock tick down to another night with barely a soul in sight. It was a Wednesday evening in July, the heat wave sweeping through the city, and the air felt thick with the weight of my doubts. The streets were quiet, the usual buzz of evening traffic muffled by the oppressive heat. I was waiting, not for customers, but for something I wasn't sure I could even name. As the evening wore on, I sat behind the counter, idly flipping through an old recipe book my mother had kept for years. The air conditioning hummed weakly above me, barely cutting through the heat. I had just finished wiping down the same counter for the third time when the door creaked open and a rush of sweltering air swept in. For a moment, I thought it might be another lost tourist, seeking refuge from the heat, but when I looked up, I saw him. Tall, well-dressed, and strikingly out of place in my humble bistro. His designer jacket clung to his broad shoulders, the kind of coat that probably cost more than my rent. His dark sunglasses hid most of his face, but even in the dim light, I could see the air of authority around him. He looked like someone who was used to getting what he wanted, no matter the situation. "Are you still serving?" His voice was smooth, with a faint accent I couldn't quite place. But the words were laced with a calm confidence that made me pause. I nodded, almost instinctively, as I cleared my throat. "Of course, sir. Please take a seat anywhere," I said, offering him the menu. My hand trembled slightly as I pointed toward an empty booth in the corner. The bistro was quiet, almost too quiet. He chose the booth by the window, looking at the menu with a raised eyebrow, a dismissive flicker passing over his face. I could tell he wasn't impressed. Our menu, after all, was hardly the sort of thing a high-end critic would look twice at. I returned to the kitchen, my mind racing. What could I offer him that wouldn't be completely embarrassing? We were down to a few dishes left for the night, but none of them were glamorous enough for a man who looked like he belonged in a Michelin-starred restaurant. I couldn't risk offering him something that might make him mock my family's legacy. But then again, I had no other choice. The pot pie, my grandmother's recipe, was the only dish that had always been reliable. Simple, comforting, and the one dish I had been serving for years, just as my mother had. I pulled it from the oven and prepared it with my usual care. The scent of freshly baked crust and savory filling filled the kitchen, a smell that reminded me of all the long hours spent with my mother, the way she would hum as she worked in the kitchen, her love woven into every dish. I placed the steaming plate in front of him and returned to the counter, trying to pretend I wasn't nervous. I watched him closely as he picked up his fork, ready to take that first bite. The seconds felt like an eternity. His expression remained unreadable as he took a small bite, then paused. His fork hovered in the air, his face growing still, his eyes slowly closing as if he were savoring the flavors. My heart pounded in my chest. This was it, the moment I had been dreading, the moment I had feared for so long. But instead of the scorn I expected, I saw something else. His eyes welled up with tears, and in that instant I froze. I didn't know what to do. I had just served the most feared food critic in the city my humble pot pie, and he was crying. For a moment, I thought maybe I had poisoned him. Maybe something was wrong with the food. But then he set his fork down gently and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I'm sorry. I didn't expect that, he said, his voice thick with emotion. This tastes exactly like my mother's chicken pot pie. I stood there, stunned, unsure of what to say. His mother's chicken pot pie? How could that be possible? I had always known this recipe was special, but to have someone else's memories tied up in it, memories I had no idea existed, was a shock. He looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw a vulnerability in his eyes. My mother passed away a few years ago, he continued, his voice trembling now. I've been searching for this taste, for this feeling, for years. I thought I had lost it forever. I stood there, unable to comprehend how my simple dish had made this man, this famed critic, so emotional. I had no idea what to say. I stood there, dumbfounded, my mind struggling to catch up with what was happening. This wasn't how I imagined the evening going. I had expected criticism, maybe a polite nod, a remark about the food being decent, but certainly not this. Tears. His mother's chicken pot pie? The words echoed in my mind, and I found myself sitting down across from him, unsure of what to say or how to respond. This man, someone who had made a career out of tearing apart meals and restaurants with surgical precision, was sitting here in my bistro, moved to tears by something as simple as my grandmother's recipe. I don't understand, I finally said, my voice shaking with confusion. How could this be your mother's recipe? I've been making this dish for years. It's my grandmother's recipe, passed down through generations. There's no way it's the same one. The man, Oliver, as he'd introduced himself earlier, wiped his eyes again and took a deep breath, seemingly trying to regain his composure. I never knew, he said softly, almost as if speaking to himself. I never knew it was still being made here. My mother, Catherine, she worked here when your grandmother was alive. They were close friends. She taught your grandmother how to make this dish, her chicken pot pie. And then, when she moved on, she passed it down. I always thought I'd lost it when she passed away. I could never find the right recipe, the right taste to bring me back to her kitchen. My breath caught in my throat as everything suddenly clicked. Catherine. I recognized the name instantly. Catherine Wright had been one of my grandmother's closest friends when they worked side by side at the bistro. She had taught my grandmother so many things about cooking, more than I had ever known or understood at the time. The realization that Catherine had passed down the same chicken pot pie recipe to my grandmother, and that it had been kept alive all these years, was overwhelming. But how did my grandmother end up with it? I asked, the question on the tip of my tongue. It felt like I was uncovering a long-lost secret, one that had been hiding right in front of me all along. Oliver looked down at his plate, and I could see a faint smile tugging at his lips. After my mother moved to New York, she and your grandmother stayed in touch. My mother had the recipe, but she never wrote anything down. She would tell your grandmother, cooking's about feeling, not measurements. She was stubborn like that. When she passed, I tried to recreate it, but I could never get it right. There was always something missing. He paused for a moment, then looked me in the eye. It was the margarm. That's what we called it, the secret ingredient. The word struck me like a lightning bolt. Margarm. My grandmother had always mentioned it as a sort of whisper of flavor that she added to the pot pie, but she'd never written it down. I had always thought it was a spice, something she had kept to herself as part of her mysterious cooking style. But hearing Oliver talk about it, I realized just how much it mattered to both of us, this small, unspoken touch that tied our families together. I felt my heart swell with emotion. The dish I had been so ready to give up on, the dish I had feared, was no longer relevant in today's world of culinary experimentation and food trends, was actually a bridge between our two families, between two generations of cooks, and between two people who had never even known each other. Oliver, in his search for his mother's memory, had unknowingly walked right into my bistro and found the one thing that had survived all these years. "This is amazing," I whispered, more to myself than to him. I had no idea. All this time, I thought I was just making my grandmother's recipe, but I was actually carrying a piece of your mother's legacy too. Oliver nodded slowly, a tear slipping down his cheek once more. It's not just the recipe. It's the love, the care, the history behind it. That's what I've been looking for. Something real, something that felt like home again. I've spent my career tearing down food, breaking it apart with my criticism, but in doing that, I've missed the very thing I've been searching for. Your grandmother's dish, my mother's dish. It brought me home. The weight of his words hung in the air between us, heavy and beautiful. It was as if everything I had been struggling with, my doubts about the bistro, my fear of losing my mother's legacy, had suddenly fallen into place. This dish, simple and humble, was a connection to something far more important than the fleeting trends of the restaurant world. It was about memory, about family, about love that transcended time and space. As the minutes passed, we both sat in silence, savoring the moment. I realized then that this bistro, this little corner of the world I had feared was slipping away, held more meaning than I had ever given it credit for. And maybe, just maybe, I could honor my mother's promise, not by clinging to the past, but by letting it live on in a way that was far more powerful than I had ever imagined. I sat across from Oliver, still trying to process everything he had just shared with me. The connection between our families, the shared recipe, the unspoken bond that had endured all these years. It was almost too much to grasp. My grandmother's chicken pot pie, the dish I had always thought of as a simple comfort food, had a history I never fully understood. And now, it felt like that history had come rushing back, pulling me deeper into something I hadn't even realized I was part of. Oliver's words lingered in the air, and I realized how much I had taken my mother's legacy for granted. She had always made it look easy, running the bistro and keeping the traditions alive, and I never truly understood the weight of what she had been preserving until now. I had spent so much time worrying about keeping the bistro afloat, about modernizing and making it more appealing to the new wave of diners, that I hadn't stopped to think about why it mattered in the first place. My mother had never cared about trends or what was fashionable. She had cared about creating a space where people could feel like they were coming home, where the food wasn't just sustenance, but a connection to something bigger. And I had almost lost that. As I looked at Oliver, I could see a reflection of my own internal struggle. He had spent years chasing the perfect dish, the perfect connection to his mother's memory, only to realize that it had been sitting in front of him all along. And now, here we were. Two strangers brought together by something as simple as a pot pie, a dish that had somehow become more meaningful than any of the modern, trendy meals I had been so desperate to recreate. I don't know what to do with all of this, I confessed quietly, my voice thick with emotion. I've been so focused on saving the bistro, on making it more relevant, I guess, but I've completely forgotten what made it special in the first place. My mother's recipes, the memories tied to this place, they're what people come for, aren't they? It's not about being the next big thing or chasing after what everyone else is doing. It's about offering something real. Oliver nodded, his eyes softening as he looked at me. Exactly. You've been holding on to something more valuable than you realize. People don't want flash. They want honesty. They want authenticity. And that's what your grandmother's recipe has. It's what your mother carried with her all these years, and it's what you've been carrying too, whether you knew it or not. That's what makes your bistro different from the others. It's not trying to be something it's not. It's just real. I felt a lump form in my throat. His words hit me harder than I expected. The idea that the bistro in all its simplicity was enough, that it had always been enough, was both comforting and heartbreaking. All this time, I had been so focused on the fear of failure, on trying to adapt to the changing world, that I had forgotten to see the value in what was already there. The food, the memories, the people who had walked through those doors for years, all of it was enough. It wasn't just about keeping up with trends or chasing the next big thing. It was about honoring the past and the people who had made that legacy possible. I've been scared, I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. Scared that it wasn't enough anymore. Scared that the world had moved on and I was stuck, holding on to something that didn't matter anymore. But now I see that it's never been about keeping up. It's about preserving what matters. And I don't want to let that go. Oliver smiled softly, his eyes reflecting a mix of understanding and admiration. You don't have to let it go, Gabrielle. You just have to let it be. And if you want, I can help. This place, this food, it deserves to be shared. Not because it's trendy, but because it's real. People are always looking for a taste of home, a taste of something that feels like it matters. And you've got that right here. His words gave me something I hadn't realized I was missing. Hope. Hope that the bistro could survive, not by changing who we were, but by staying true to what had always made us special. And just like that, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Maybe I didn't need to be afraid of change after all. I just needed to remember what really mattered. And I had the perfect dish to share that message with the world. The next few days felt like a whirlwind. As I stood in the kitchen, preparing dish after dish of my grandmother's chicken pot pie, I couldn't shake the feeling that something big was shifting, both in the bistro and within me. After Oliver's visit, I couldn't help but look at the bistro with new eyes. It wasn't just a failing business. It was a place steeped in history, full of memories and connections that I had almost let slip away. The bistro, my mother's bistro, had always been about more than just food. It was about community, warmth, and the stories we shared over the simplest of meals. And I had nearly forgotten that in my desperation to keep up with the modern world. The weight of Oliver's words stayed with me. It's about preserving what matters. I had spent so much time trying to change the bistro, trying to make it relevant, that I had neglected the very things that made it special. As much as I hated to admit it, Julian had been right in his own way. But he hadn't understood that it wasn't about stubbornly holding on to the past. It was about honoring what had come before and making sure it didn't get lost in the rush of trends. The bistro had a soul, and that soul was built on my family's traditions. It was that realization that pushed me to make a decision I hadn't thought possible just a few weeks ago. I wasn't going to change the menu. Instead, I was going to embrace it, breathe new life into it by sharing the stories behind the food, the memories, and the connections that had always been a part of this place. I could feel my mother's presence with me in the kitchen, guiding me, just like she had when I was younger, standing beside her as she stirred sauces and chopped vegetables, teaching me the art of making food that wasn't just to be eaten, but to be remembered. I started by reworking the menu, but instead of adding trendy items or modernizing the classics, I wrote about the history behind each dish. The chicken pot pie, of course, had a prominent place, and I made sure to include the story of how my grandmother and Catherine Wright had passed it down through generations. I wanted people to know that this wasn't just a dish, it was a legacy. Each bite was a connection to my past, to Oliver's past, and to a time when food wasn't just about impressing someone, but about feeding the soul. As the changes began to take shape, something incredible happened. The bistro started to feel alive again. I could see it in the faces of the people who came through the door. Familiar regulars who hadn't been in for months, and newcomers who had heard the buzz and wanted to see what the fuss was about. They didn't just come for the food. They came for the stories. They came for the sense of belonging that my mother had always offered. They came for the memories. Oliver's essay, the one he had written about his mother's recipe and the bistro's legacy, had been published in several food magazines, and before long, the attention started pouring in. It wasn't just food critics. People from all over the city were making reservations, eager to taste the dish that had moved a critic like Oliver to tears. I never imagined that a simple chicken pot pie could spark such a wave of interest, but it did. The bistro was no longer just a fading relic of the past. It was a place that had rediscovered its purpose. But even with the newfound success, I knew this wasn't about the crowds, the reservations, or the money. It was about honoring my mother, my grandmother, and the history that had been passed down through generations. It was about staying true to who we were, not because it was easy, but because it was right. Every night as I served that chicken pot pie, I remembered why I started this in the first place. To make people feel at home, to give them something that would stay with them long after they left the bistro. Oliver came back a few weeks later, and this time it wasn't because of the blizzard. He had made the trip from New York just to see for himself how the bistro had transformed. As we sat down together, he smiled and raised his glass. "You did it, Gabrielle," he said. "You didn't just save the bistro. You've given it something it never had before, a story." And in that moment, I realized that he was right. The bistro had always been more than just food. It was a story waiting to be told, and now we were telling it. A month had passed since the changes started, and the bistro felt more alive than I could have imagined. The atmosphere had shifted, not just because the place was bustling with new and old faces, but because something deeper had settled in. People weren't just coming for the food, they were coming for the connection. They were coming to experience a piece of history, to sit at a table where the air was thick with memories, and to taste food that was rich with meaning. I could feel my mother's presence everywhere, the way she had poured her heart into every dish, the way she had made sure that the simplest meals carried the weight of generations. It was as though she was there beside me in the kitchen, guiding me, just like when I was a little girl. The rush of customers was both exhilarating and overwhelming. I had to hire back the 2 waiters I had let go months ago, and I found myself back in the kitchen more than I had in years, making sure every dish was prepared just as it had been for decades. The chicken pot pie was a staple, but we had added a few more of my mother's signature dishes to the menu, along with the stories behind each one. People weren't just ordering food. They were asking questions, wanting to know more about the recipes, about my grandmother's secret ingredients, about Catherine Wright, and how our family's histories were intertwined. It felt like they were hungry for more than just a meal. They were hungry for a story, for something real. One evening, after the dinner rush had settled, I found myself standing in front of the stove, stirring a fresh batch of soup, when the door opened, and I looked up to see Oliver walking in. This time, he wasn't wearing his designer jacket or looking like he had just stepped out of a 5-star restaurant. He looked more relaxed, almost like he belonged here. A few weeks had passed since his essay had been published, and the buzz had only grown louder. He had become more than just the critic who had discovered us. He had become a part of our story. "Evening, Gabrielle," he said with a grin, taking a seat at the counter. "Thought I'd check in on my favorite bistro. How's everything going?" I smiled, wiping my hands on my apron. "Better than I could have ever hoped for," I said. "I've never been this busy in my life. It's like people are rediscovering what food really means." I paused, my voice growing softer. "And I'm finally understanding what you meant, about food being more than just what's on the plate. It's about the connection." Oliver leaned back in his stool, his eyes lighting up with genuine warmth. "I'm glad you're seeing that," he said, his voice quieter now. "The food, the memories, it's what makes a place like this worth saving. And you've done it. You've saved it." He paused, his gaze thoughtful. "You've turned a bistro into something people want to remember. It's not about trends. It's about authenticity. It's about love." I felt a swell of gratitude toward him. He had been more than just a critic. He had been a catalyst for something I hadn't even known I was searching for. His words had pushed me to see my bistro and my family's legacy in a whole new light. We sat in silence for a moment, and I realized how much I had changed in such a short time. A few months ago, I was on the verge of closing down, caught between fear and loyalty to a past that seemed like it couldn't survive in the present. But now, I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. Not because I had reinvented the bistro, but because I had remembered what made it special in the first place. It was the history, the love, the memories that had been passed down like heirlooms, and it was the people who came to share in that experience. The doorbell jingled as another customer walked in, and I turned back to Oliver. "Well, I'd better get back to work," I said with a smile. "But you're welcome to stay as long as you like. I'm sure we have plenty of chicken pot pie left." Oliver chuckled, shaking his head. "I think I've had enough for one lifetime. But if you're writing a cookbook anytime soon, you know where to find me." I laughed, nodding. "Funny you should say that," I said, the thought of a cookbook now feeling less like a distant dream and more like something I might actually pursue. A story, a legacy, something to share with the world, something to preserve, just like my mother had wanted. As I turned back to the kitchen, I couldn't help but think about the road ahead. I wasn't sure what the future held for La Petite Cuisine, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to embrace it. With my grandmother's recipe, my mother's spirit, and a renewed sense of purpose, I knew that whatever came next, I was ready to honor the past while moving forward into a future that felt just as meaningful. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity, but they were also the most fulfilling weeks I'd had in a long time. The bistro had transformed, not just in the way it looked, but in the way it felt. The energy had shifted. There was a buzz in the air every evening, a sense of anticipation and excitement as people filed through the door, eager to taste the dishes that had once felt so ordinary to me. It wasn't just the food that had changed. It was the connection, the way the bistro had become a place of community once again. I spent my days in the kitchen, perfecting each dish, making sure that every bite lived up to the stories I had begun sharing with the customers. The chicken pot pie was still the star of the menu, but now it came with a story. A story about my grandmother, about Catherine Wright, about love and memory passed down through generations. Every dish had its own tale, and I began to see how those stories mattered more than I had ever realized. Oliver's essay had gone viral, and the attention from food critics and food bloggers kept pouring in. But it wasn't just the critics that were flocking to the bistro. It was regular people, families, and tourists who had heard about us through word of mouth. It felt like the bistro was alive again, breathing in a way I hadn't seen in years. The place was packed every night, and I had to bring in more help, hiring 2 new waiters and a part-time cook to keep up with the demand. But even with the increased workload, I felt a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt before. I wasn't just running a restaurant anymore. I was sharing a piece of history, a part of my family's legacy. One evening, after the dinner rush had calmed down, I took a moment to step outside and catch my breath. The weather had cooled, and the air felt fresh against my skin. As I stood there, looking at the twinkling lights of the neighborhood, I realized just how far we had come. A year ago, I had been on the brink of closing the doors for good. I had been ready to walk away, convinced that the bistro was no longer relevant in a world that seemed to move too fast. But now, I was standing outside a thriving bistro that was more alive than it had ever been. And the best part? It wasn't because of some trendy new menu item or a flashy redesign. It was because I had chosen to stay true to what mattered most: the food, the memories, and the connections we had built over decades. As I stood there, lost in thought, I heard the familiar jingle of the door opening. I turned to see Oliver walking toward me, a warm smile on his face. He had been coming by regularly, more out of curiosity than anything else, to see how things were going. I motioned for him to join me outside, and he did, taking a seat at one of the small tables. "So, how's it been?" he asked, settling in comfortably. "The place looks like it's thriving." I nodded, still in awe of how much had changed in such a short amount of time. "It's unbelievable," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I never thought it could turn around like this. The buzz, the customers, it's more than I could have hoped for. People are coming for the food, but they're staying for the stories. They're connecting to something real." Oliver smiled, his eyes gleaming with pride. "I'm glad to hear that. You've built something special here, Gabrielle. I think your mother would be proud." His words hit me harder than I expected. It was the first time anyone had mentioned my mother in the context of the bistro's success, and it reminded me why I had fought so hard to keep this place going. My mother had never been about the accolades or the recognition. She had just wanted to feed people, to give them a sense of home, of comfort, of belonging. And now I was doing the same, but in a way that honored her legacy while also carving my own path. I hope so, I said softly, my voice catching in my throat. I hope she'd be proud. Oliver leaned back in his chair, watching me carefully. You've done more than just keep her dream alive, Gabrielle. You've made it your own. And that's the most important thing. I nodded, grateful for his insight. It was something I hadn't fully realized until now. The bistro wasn't just a place where I worked. It was a part of me, a reflection of everything I had learned from my mother, from my grandmother, and from the generations that had come before me. It was a legacy that I was proud to carry forward, one plate at a time. As we sat there in silence, the weight of the past few months settling in, I knew that this was just the beginning. The bistro wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. And no matter what the future held, I was ready to face it, knowing that I had finally found my place in the story of La Petite Cuisine. A few months had passed since everything changed, and the bistro was now a place of steady hustle and warmth, a place that felt like it belonged. The clatter of plates and laughter of customers filled the air each night, the smells of freshly baked goods and savory dishes lingering long after the last table had cleared. Every corner of the bistro was infused with a new sense of life, and yet there was a comfort in it all that had never been there before. It felt like the bistro had been reborn, but with the same soul it had always had. Only now it was thriving in ways I had never imagined possible. One afternoon, I was behind the counter, sorting through the books and jotting down notes, when a familiar face walked in. It was Oliver, looking as relaxed as I'd ever seen him. He'd become a regular, not just as a critic, but as someone I could talk to about the bistro, its future, and the way it had grown in such unexpected ways. He had become more than just the food critic who saved us. He had become a friend, a mentor of sorts, someone who had been with me through the highs and lows of the bistro's revival. He wasn't here to judge the food anymore. He was here to enjoy it. Gabrielle, he greeted me with his usual easy smile, sliding into his favorite spot at the counter. Another busy night, I see. I couldn't help but grin, wiping my hands on my apron before walking over to join him. It's never been busier, I said, a mix of pride and disbelief in my voice. I'm actually thinking of expanding the menu a little. People keep asking for more, and I think it's time to try something new while still keeping the heart of what we do. Oliver raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. That's a big step. You're not about to start serving quinoa and kale, are you? I laughed, shaking my head. Not even close, I said, rolling my eyes. I'm thinking about adding a few more of my mother's old recipes, some of the ones she never quite had time to perfect. You know, the ones she'd always talk about, but never actually put on the menu. They've been sitting in the back of my mind for months now. I think it's time to give them a place here. He nodded thoughtfully. I think that sounds like a perfect idea. You've built a brand here, Gabrielle, and it's not just about the food anymore. It's about the stories, the connections. People come here because they want to be part of something meaningful. They want to feel like they're part of your family. His words hit me harder than I expected. He was right. It wasn't just about the food anymore. It hadn't been for a while. Yes, the chicken pot pie still reigned supreme, and it would always be the cornerstone of our menu. But what made the bistro special, what made it stand out, was the sense of belonging people found here. They came for the food, sure, but they stayed for the warmth, the sense of history, and the idea that they were a part of something bigger than themselves. And that wasn't just because of the food. It was because of the stories we shared, the connections we made. As I stood there, staring at the bustling bistro, I thought about how much had changed in such a short time. My mother's bistro, once a place I feared was on the brink of closing, had found new life. And in the process, I had found a deeper understanding of what it meant to truly honor the past while embracing the future. You know, I said, glancing at Oliver with a smile, I've been thinking about writing a book, about the bistro, the recipes, the stories, about everything that's brought this place back to life. I don't know if I'm ready, but I think it could be a way to preserve everything my mother started here." Oliver's eyes lit up, and for a moment, he looked almost proud. "I think that's an incredible idea," he said. "A book would be a perfect way to share the story, to let people know what makes this place and you so special. And if you ever need help, you know where to find me." His words felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders. It wasn't just the idea of writing a book that made me feel lighter. It was the realization that the bistro, the legacy, and the stories weren't just mine anymore. They were part of something bigger. They had become a part of this community, this place, this story. And as I looked around the bistro, watching the faces of people enjoying their meals, I realized that this was exactly what my mother had wanted all along. Not just to keep the bistro alive, but to create a space where memories were made, where people could gather and feel like they belonged. With a deep breath, I smiled at Oliver. "I think it's time. Let's do it." And with that, I felt more certain than ever that the bistro's story was just beginning. There was so much more to come. It's funny how things can change in the blink of an eye. One minute, I was standing on the edge of a decision that felt impossible, facing the potential end of my family's legacy. And the next, I was overwhelmed by the possibilities that lay ahead. The idea of writing a book, of sharing the story of La Petite Cuisine and the recipes that had been passed down for generations, had been just a seed of a thought not long ago. But now, it felt like the next natural step in preserving everything that had made this place so special. I spent the next few weeks immersed in the process, poring over old recipe cards, my mother's handwritten notes, and the memories I'd tucked away for years. It wasn't just about gathering the recipes. It was about gathering the stories, the emotions tied to each dish. I wanted to share what made La Petite Cuisine more than just a bistro. It was a space where people came not just to eat, but to experience something real. It was about comfort, connection, and the small moments that made life meaningful. Every dish had a story. Every meal had a memory attached to it. And I realized I wanted to capture that. Oliver had become a surprising source of support through this process. He had long since retired from his food critic career, but he remained a friend, offering advice and encouragement as I began to shape the book. His insights into storytelling and how food could transcend the plate helped me find my voice. He kept reminding me that the heart of the book wasn't just about the recipes. It was about what those recipes meant to people. It was about the love, the history, and the people who walked through the doors of La Petite Cuisine and made it their own. As I worked on the book, I started to see the bistro in a new light. The customers who came in every night, they weren't just patrons. They were part of the story, too. It was the elderly couple who had been coming since they were newlyweds, the young mother who brought her children to the same booth her parents had sat in for decades. It was the group of friends celebrating birthdays, anniversaries, and new beginnings. Each person who walked through the door brought their own chapter to the story of the bistro. And I realized that this wasn't just my family's legacy. It was a shared legacy, woven together by every person who had ever stepped foot in this place. The book was starting to take shape, and it felt like something my mother would be proud of. Every word, every recipe, every story was a tribute to her, to my grandmother, to Catherine Wright, and to all the hands that had shaped La Petite Cuisine into the place it was. It was more than just a cookbook. It was a way of passing down what mattered most. It was a way of ensuring that the memories, the love, and the traditions would continue long after I was gone. But as I neared the end of writing, I found myself feeling a bit of uncertainty. The bistro had become more than just a restaurant to me. It had become my purpose. And now, with the book nearly finished, I was facing a new question. What's next? What happens when you finally achieve something you thought was impossible? The answer, I realized, wasn't as daunting as I'd once thought. What comes next is simply more of the same. More stories, more food, more memories. La Petite Cuisine wasn't just a place that had been saved. It was a place that was always evolving. And as long as I could keep honoring the past while embracing the future, the bistro would continue to thrive, just as it always had. As I closed the book on the final draft, I looked around the bistro, filled with the familiar faces, the hum of conversation, and the clink of silverware. I knew that this was just the beginning. There were more stories to tell, more meals to serve, and more memories to be made. And for the first time in a long time, I was excited to see where this journey would take me. The future was uncertain, but the past had given me everything I needed to move forward. Life often feels like a series of challenges, but the key is to stay true to what truly matters. Embrace your roots, your family, and the traditions that define you, but don't be afraid to evolve. The best way to move forward is by honoring the past, learning from it, and sharing it with others. Whether it's a recipe, a story, or a simple gesture, what you offer to the world with love and authenticity has the power to create meaningful connections. Trust in the value of your journey. And remember, sometimes the most important things are the simplest.